I moved into the quiet cul-de-sac on a rainy Tuesday. The moving truck had left just an hour earlier, leaving me with stacks of boxes and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Through the front window, I saw what I was up against. My new neighbors had lawns that looked like they'd been measured with rulers and trimmed with nail scissors. Each house stood in perfect uniformity. Same beige mailboxes, same tasteful landscaping, same subdued exterior colors. My yard, with its patchy grass and overgrown edges, stuck out like a sore thumb. The dusty blue Tacoma in my driveway looked even more out of place next to the Mercedes and Lexus vehicles parked in nearby driveways. "What do you think, Max?" I asked, looking down at my golden retriever who sat beside me, his tail sweeping across the hardwood floor. "Not exactly what the real estate photos promised, huh?" Max gave a soft woof in response and wandered off to inspect our new home. I went back to unpacking kitchen boxes when movement caught my eye. Across the street, curtains swiftly closed as I looked up. 2 houses down, a woman in a tracksuit slowed her power walk to an obvious crawl as she passed my driveway, her eyes scanning my property like she was conducting an inspection. On the second day, I caught 3 different neighbors driving by at unusually slow speeds. By the third day, I'd become familiar with the pattern. People would walk their perfectly groomed dogs past my house, steal glances at my yard, and occasionally whisper into their phones. I was halfway through assembling a bookshelf when the doorbell rang. Max trotted over, curious but calm. "Stay here, buddy," I told him, closing the living room door behind me. Through the peephole, I saw a woman standing with perfect posture, her blonde hair cut in what I could only describe as an aggressively neat bob. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of disapproval. I opened the door and offered a friendly smile. "Hello. Mr. Merritt, I presume?" Her voice had the carefully measured tone of someone who believed they held authority. "That's right, Jake Merritt. I'm Karen Phillips, president of the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association." She thrust forward a spiral-bound book that looked thicker than some college textbooks I'd owned. "This is our community handbook. I noticed you've just moved in, so I wanted to make sure you received this right away." I accepted the manual with a polite nod. "Thanks." Her eyes darted past me, catching sight of moving boxes and what was probably, by her standards, chaos. We take great pride in maintaining the highest standards in our community. The handbook outlines all our regulations regarding exterior maintenance, approved paint colors, lawn care schedules, and community conduct. I'll be sure to look it over. A soft whine came from behind the living room door where Max waited. Karen's eyebrows rose slightly. "You have a dog?" "Yes, Max. He's a golden retriever." Her smile tightened. "Well, you'll find our pet policies on page 34. Barking must be controlled, and animals must be leashed at all times when outdoors. We've had issues with aggressive dogs in the past." Max, who had once been frightened by a particularly loud butterfly, was about as aggressive as a marshmallow. "He's very well behaved," I said. "I'm sure he is." Her tone suggested she was anything but sure. "The garbage collection information is on page 17. Bins cannot be visible from the street except between 6 p.m. the night before and 6 p.m. the day of collection." I nodded, maintaining my friendly expression, even as I calculated how many rules I'd already broken in 3 days. "Welcome to Pinecrest Estates, Mr. Merritt. I hope you'll find our community as special as we all do." With a final glance at my untucked shirt and the dusty truck in my driveway, she turned and walked away, her back straight as a ruler. I closed the door, let Max out of the living room, and dropped the handbook on the kitchen counter without opening it. That weekend, I made a trip to the hardware store. The forecast showed clear skies, perfect for some yard work, and settling in. I picked up a few items that weren't on my original shopping list. A set of wind chimes with a deep, resonant tone, an American flag on a garden stake, and some flowers for the beds out front. Deliberately, I bypassed the paint section where I could have found beige paint for my navy blue mailbox. By mid-afternoon Saturday, I had the wind chimes hanging from my front porch. They made a pleasant sound whenever the breeze picked up. The American flag stood proudly in my garden bed, and I'd planted the flowers in what I'd call an artistic arrangement rather than the geometric precision my neighbors seemed to prefer. Max lounged in a patch of sun on the lawn while I worked, occasionally getting up to investigate an interesting smell or to bring me a tennis ball. I was watering the new plants when I felt eyes on my back. Turning slightly, I spotted Karen standing in her driveway 3 houses down. She made no attempt to hide her scrutiny, her phone pressed to her ear as she paced back and forth. Even from this distance, I could read the rigid disapproval in her posture. "Looks like we've made a friend, Max," I said quietly. Later that afternoon, an elderly couple walked by slowly. The man used a cane, but he paused long enough to lift his free hand in a hesitant wave. I nodded back with a smile, and they continued their careful progress down the sidewalk. A young family passed by not long after. Mom, Dad, and 2 kids on bikes with training wheels. The parents glanced at my house with obvious curiosity, then at Karen's house, then back to me. The father gave me a quick nod before hurrying his family along. As the sun began to dip, I sat on my front steps with Max beside me, both of us watching the quiet street. A man in a golf shirt walked by, his eyes fixed straight ahead as if my house didn't exist. Minutes later, a woman jogged past, slowing just enough to give me a small smile when she thought no one else was looking. I scratched behind Max's ears as we observed the neighborhood's careful dance. "I think we're going to shake things up around here, buddy." The wind picked up, setting the chimes into a gentle melody. Across the street, I caught the slight movement of curtains again. I had worked in enough environments to recognize power structures when I saw them. This neighborhood had its hierarchy, its unwritten rules beyond what was in that spiral-bound book. Karen Phillips sat at the top, maintaining order through what looked like a mixture of intimidation and rigid enforcement. The others fell into line, some willingly, some reluctantly. What they didn't know yet was that I had spent my career dealing with people who thought rules only applied to others. I understood neighborhood dynamics well enough to recognize the battle lines being drawn, and I wasn't particularly concerned about standing alone on my side of that line. 2 weeks into settling in at Pinecrest Estates, I found the first note in my mailbox. The crisp white paper was folded with military precision, tucked beside my electric bill. I recognized Karen Phillips' handwriting immediately, the same neat penmanship from the sign-in sheet at the mailbox cluster where we'd crossed paths a few days earlier. The note detailed my violations of community standards with surprising specificity. 1. Mailbox color, navy blue, not on approved color list, page 22. 2. Wind chimes not approved by exterior decor committee, page 41. 3. Front garden arrangement does not conform to neighborhood aesthetic, page 27. 4. Vehicle, Tacoma truck, shows visible dirt and dust, page 36. 5. Lawn height exceeds 3.25 inches in northwest corner, page 19. At the bottom was a reminder that failure to address these issues may result in fines as outlined in the HOA bylaws, followed by Karen's signature, complete with her title as HOA president. I smiled, brought the note inside, and pinned it to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like the state of Michigan that I'd bought on a road trip years ago. Max looked up from his bed in the corner of the kitchen, his tail thumping against the cushion. "First official warning, buddy," I told him. "Should we frame it?" The next morning, I took Max for our now routine walk around the block. The early hour meant fewer neighbors were out, but Mr. Chen from 2 doors down was retrieving his newspaper. He gave me a quick nod before hurrying back inside. I'd noticed that pattern with several neighbors, brief acknowledgments when Karen wasn't around, followed by swift retreats. We rounded the corner to find Mrs. Abernathy working on her rose bushes. Unlike most neighbors, she straightened up and offered a genuine smile. "Good morning," she called. "Beautiful dog you have there." "Thank you," I replied. "This is Max." She came closer, hand extended for Max to sniff. "I had a golden years ago. Sweetest dog I've ever known." Max's tail wagged as she scratched behind his ears. "I see you've met our HOA president," she said, glancing toward Karen's house farther down the street. "I have indeed." "Don't let her push you around too much. Some of us appreciate a little character in the neighborhood." With that cryptic comment, she returned to her roses. 3 more notes followed within a week. Each one grew increasingly detailed, citing specific sections of the HOA handbook I still hadn't opened. The second note focused entirely on my lawn care schedule. The third expressed community concerns about Max being potentially uncontrolled during our morning walks, despite the fact that he never left my side and was always leashed. The fourth note mentioned noise complaints about the wind chimes, with timestamps included. I pinned each one to the refrigerator in a neat row, creating what Max and I now referred to as our Wall of Fame. Every morning, we continued our walks, and I began mentally categorizing the neighbors into 3 groups. The averters, who looked away when they saw us coming. The cautious smilers, who offered friendly gestures only when they thought no one was watching. And the brave ones, like Mrs. Abernathy, who engaged openly. The couple at the end of the cul-de-sac fell into the latter category. The husband, who introduced himself as Jim, even complimented the wind chimes as we passed. "Reminds me of the ones my grandmother had," he said. "Nice to hear something besides silence around here." The escalation came on a Thursday evening when I returned from work. A bright yellow notice was taped to my front door, the paper trembling in the evening breeze, the very sound that Karen claimed disturbed the neighborhood peace. The notice was printed on official HOA letterhead. Violation notice re: Unapproved exterior sound device. Wind chimes. Section 41(3) of Community Bylaws prohibits any device producing persistent noise that travels beyond property boundaries. Fine schedule: $50, first offense, $100, second offense, $250, subsequent offenses. Action required: immediate removal of wind chimes from exterior of property. I took it down, added it to our collection on the refrigerator, and deliberated over dinner. Max watched me from his bed, head tilted in that way dogs have of asking what's wrong. "What do you think, Max? Should we fight City Hall?" He yawned in response. That night, I left the wind chimes exactly where they were, their gentle melody accompanying me to sleep. Saturday morning brought clear skies and perfect weather for yard work. I was just about to trim the supposedly overgrown northwest corner of my lawn when a white van with County Animal Control printed on the side pulled up to the curb. A young officer stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking uncomfortable as he approached my front door. I met him halfway up the walk. "Good morning," I said. "Mr. Merritt?" He checked his paperwork. "I'm Officer Daniels with County Animal Control. We received a complaint about an aggressive dog at this address, reportedly unleashed and threatening passers-by." I kept my expression neutral. "Is that right?" "Yes, sir. The complaint was quite detailed." "Would you like to meet the aggressive dog in question?" He nodded, clearly relieved I wasn't being confrontational. I led him inside where Max was sleeping on his orthopedic bed in the living room. At our entrance, he barely lifted his head, offering a slow tail wag before settling back down. Officer Daniels laughed despite himself. "This is the menace to society?" "That's him. 6 years old, certified therapy dog for 3 of those years. He used to visit the children's hospital before we moved." The officer scratched Max behind the ears. "Well, he's clearly a danger to public safety. Might lick someone to death." He made a few notes on his clipboard. "Look, I have to file a report since a complaint was made, but I'll note that I found no evidence of an aggressive animal or violations of leash laws." "Do you know who filed the complaint?" I asked, though I already knew. "Can't disclose that officially," he said, then paused. "But I'd suggest checking with anyone who might have recently submitted other complaints about your property." After he left, I took Max for an extra long walk, making sure to pass by Karen's house twice. That evening, I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee, enjoying the mild weather and the musical tones of my still-hanging wind chimes. Max lounged at my feet, occasionally lifting his head when a car passed or a neighbor walked by. Around 7, I saw Karen walking purposefully down the sidewalk, phone in hand. She stopped directly in front of my house and began taking photos of my mailbox, my garden beds, my truck in the driveway, and Max resting peacefully by my side. She didn't bother hiding her actions. When she noticed me watching, she raised her chin defiantly, as if daring me to object. I simply raised my coffee mug in a toast and continued sipping. Her expression tightened, but she took several more photos before marching back down the street toward her house. Max looked up at me, his eyes questioning. "Just documenting evidence, I suppose," I told him, scratching his head. "But so am I, buddy. So am I." I watched Karen's retreating figure, noting how she stopped to speak with another neighbor, gesturing back toward my house. The neighbor nodded politely but glanced my way with what looked like curiosity rather than disapproval. The wind chimes sounded again, their melody carrying across the early evening air. For some reason, at that moment, they sounded particularly sweet. A month passed, and the tension with Karen Phillips transformed from a quiet simmer into a full boil. The notes kept coming, each one more detailed and threatening than the last. My violations had expanded from the original list to include everything from excessive dog hair visible through front windows to unapproved placement of garden hose. I remained unfazed, continuing to pin each notice to my refrigerator. Max and I took our morning walks. I worked in my garden on weekends, and the wind chimes played their melody every time the breeze picked up. My navy blue mailbox remained stubbornly unpainted. Karen's tactics evolved from passive-aggressive notes to active harassment. She scheduled landscaping crews to begin work at 7 a.m. sharp on Saturdays, right outside my bedroom window. The HOA suddenly needed to inspect water meters twice weekly, always when I had just settled in for dinner. 3 times I came home to find official-looking pre-violation notices attached to my door for infractions that weren't even in the handbook. I didn't push back. Not yet. On Tuesday afternoon, I pulled onto my street after a long day at the office to find a sight that finally crossed the line. A white tow truck was backing into my driveway, its yellow lights flashing as it prepared to hook up my Tacoma. Karen stood on the sidewalk nearby, arms folded across her chest, wearing an expression of pure victory. I parked my work car at the curb and walked over. The tow truck driver, a heavy-set guy with a salt-and-pepper beard, looked up as I approached. The discomfort on his face told me this wasn't a routine job. "Is there a problem here?" I asked, keeping my voice level. The driver glanced between me and Karen, who had now moved closer. "HOA president reported this vehicle abandoned. Been sitting too long without being moved and violates community standards." He didn't sound convinced of it himself. "This is my truck," I said, "and I drove it yesterday." Karen stepped forward, clutching a copy of the HOA handbook. Section 36.2 clearly states that vehicles must be maintained in a manner consistent with neighborhood aesthetics. She pointed at my truck with a manicured finger. "That vehicle has visible dust, mud on the wheel wells, and what appears to be a dent in the rear bumper." She was right about the dent. A souvenir from a minor parking lot bump years ago that wasn't worth fixing. The mud was from a rainstorm 2 days ago. The handbook also states, she continued, that vehicles showing signs of disrepair or neglect may be removed at the owner's expense after proper notification. She held up a piece of paper. "This notification was placed on your windshield 3 days ago." I hadn't seen any notice, and judging by its pristine condition, it had never been outside. Something in me finally clicked into place. Not anger. I'd dealt with bullies throughout my career and knew how they operated. This was a different feeling. The cool, clear certainty that comes when you've been patient long enough. "Give me a minute," I said to the tow truck driver, who nodded, clearly wanting no part of this confrontation. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Karen watched, her victory smile still in place but starting to waver at the edges. "Angela, Jake Merritt here. I need to request a full financial and compliance audit for Homeowners Association 472A in Greenfield County. Yes, that's right. Full scope, 5-year look back. I have reason to believe there may be significant irregularities." Karen's smile vanished, replaced by confusion. "Priority level? Let's call it moderate. I'd like preliminary findings within 2 weeks, if possible." I paused, listening. "Yes, I'll email the specifics when I get inside. Thanks, Angela." I ended the call and turned to Karen, whose face had drained of color. You can't do that," she stammered. "Actually, Mrs. Phillips, I can. I should have introduced myself more thoroughly when I moved in. Jake Merritt, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Compliance and Financial Oversight Division." I hadn't mentioned my profession because I enjoyed the separation between work and home life, but Karen had effectively bulldozed that boundary. "That's a government vehicle enforcement office," the tow truck driver muttered, already reaching for the controls to lower my truck back to the ground. Karen's mouth opened and closed without sound. "While we're discussing compliance," I continued, "I've noticed some inconsistencies in the neighborhood financials that have been bothering me. The pool deck renovation last year cost $120,000, according to the annual report, but the contractor's permit filed with the county listed the project at $72,000. That's quite a discrepancy." Her eyes widened just enough to confirm my suspicion. "And the surplus HOA dues that were supposedly being held in an interest-bearing account for future capital improvements. The financial statement shows that account at nearly $200,000, but there's no indication of earned interest. Odd, considering current rates." I'd worked enough financial fraud cases to recognize the signs. Small homeowners associations were perfect vehicles for embezzlement. Minimal oversight, regular cash flow, and board members who often had cozy relationships with service providers. This is harassment," Karen finally managed. "You can't investigate us because of personal grievances." "You're partially right. I wouldn't normally look into my own neighborhood's finances. But when you made this personal by trying to have my legally parked vehicle towed under false pretenses, you triggered my professional interest. Funny how that works." The tow truck driver had already unhooked his equipment and was climbing back into his cab, clearly wanting to escape the situation. "Bill the HOA for your service call," I told him. He nodded gratefully and pulled away with impressive speed for such a large vehicle. Karen stood frozen on my driveway, her handbook clutched against her chest like a shield. Her perfectly composed facade had cracked, revealing the panic underneath. "The board meeting is tomorrow night," she said, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps we could discuss this misunderstanding." "I'm afraid this has moved beyond a neighborly chat, Mrs. Phillips. The audit request has been filed. The process will take its course." I headed toward my front door. "You might want to gather your financial records. The auditors are very thorough." I went inside without looking back, greeted by Max's enthusiastic welcome. Through the window, I watched Karen walk stiffly back to her house, phone already pressed to her ear. That evening, I ate dinner at my kitchen table while reviewing case files for work. Around 8 o'clock, emergency lights caught my attention, blue reflections bouncing off the houses across the street. I looked out to see a police cruiser parked outside the community center where the HOA board held their meetings. Within 10 minutes, cars began arriving. I recognized Thomas Phillips' SUV, followed by the sedans and crossovers of the other board members. They hurried inside, looking worried and confused. Karen had arrived earlier, presumably to prepare for whatever emergency meeting she had called. The lights in the community center burned late into the night. I sipped tea and watched the comings and goings, a board member rushing out to make a phone call, then hurrying back inside. Thomas Phillips pacing in the parking lot, the police officer eventually leaving around 10. The meeting continued, voices occasionally rising loud enough to be heard across the quiet street, though the words remained indistinct. Just before midnight, The lights in the community center finally went dark. Board members trickled out to their cars, faces grim. Karen and Thomas were the last to leave, walking separately to their SUV and driving away in silence. I closed my curtains and went to bed, Max curling up in his usual spot on the floor beside me. Whatever storm was brewing in the Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association, it had been a long time coming, and I had simply been the catalyst. The audit results arrived exactly 14 days after my request. A thick manila envelope waited in my mailbox bearing the seal of the Financial Oversight Division. I tucked it under my arm as Max and I completed our morning walk, nodding to Mr. Chen, who had graduated from quick acknowledgments to actual waves. Back home, I made coffee before sitting at the kitchen table to review the findings. Max settled into his bed with a contented sigh as I opened the envelope and spread the documents across the table. The report was thorough, just as I'd expected from Angela's team. 5 years of HOA financial records laid bare, with discrepancies highlighted in yellow and potential violations flagged in red. There was enough yellow and red on those pages to decorate a Chinese New Year celebration. The pattern was simple but effective. Karen and Thomas Phillips had systematically inflated vendor contracts, approved fake maintenance expenses, and directed the excess funds into a separate account disguised as a contingency reserve. That account, registered to a shell company with Karen listed as the primary contact, had accumulated over $230,000 in 5 years, all from the small monthly fees collected from homeowners who believed they were paying for community upkeep. I wasn't surprised. In my line of work, I'd seen plenty of small-scale frauds that followed this exact template. What did surprise me was the brazenness. They hadn't even tried very hard to hide it. The arrogance suggested years of operating without anyone asking questions. The report included a formal notice that the findings had been shared with the county prosecutor's office, with a recommendation for further investigation. Criminal charges would be their decision, not mine. I closed the folder and sipped my coffee, watching Max stretch in his sleep. Part of me felt a twinge of remorse, not for Karen and Thomas, who had certainly earned whatever legal consequences came their way, but for the neighborhood that would now have to process this betrayal of trust. The community newsletter arrived the next morning, earlier than its usual Saturday delivery. The front page featured a brief announcement in bold type. The Pinecrest Estates HOA Board regrets to announce the resignation of Karen Phillips as president, effective immediately, for personal reasons. An emergency board meeting will be held tonight at 7 p.m. in the community center to elect new leadership. All homeowners are encouraged to attend. No mention of the audit or financial discrepancies. The rest of the newsletter contained the usual announcements about garbage collection schedule changes and reminders about the upcoming community garage sale. That afternoon, Max and I took our usual walk around the block. As we approached the Phillips house, I noticed the fresh "For Sale" sign already planted in their front yard, its metal legs driven deep into the perfectly manicured grass Karen had been so proud of. Thomas moved back and forth from the garage to their SUV, loading cardboard boxes with mechanical efficiency. When he saw Max and me approaching, he ducked his head and disappeared into the garage, re-emerging only after we had passed. I didn't slow down or stop. Whatever satisfaction I might have felt was tempered by the knowledge that an entire community had been defrauded, and that my actions, however justified, had upended lives. Not just Karen and Thomas's, but potentially their children's, if they had any, and certainly their standing in whatever social circles they moved in. That evening at 6:55, I watched from my front porch as neighbors streamed toward the community center. The usual cliques moved in tight formations, the retired couples from the east side of the neighborhood, the young families from the cul-de-sac, the single professionals from the townhomes at the entrance. But there was a different energy now, a buzz of animated conversation replacing the usual subdued greetings. I considered attending, but decided against it. My involvement had served its purpose, and the community needed to heal and rebuild on its own terms. From my vantage point, I could see the meeting room's windows. Hands raised in votes, people standing to speak, heads nodding or shaking in agreement or dissent. The meeting lasted over 2 hours, much longer than the usual rubber stamp sessions Karen had conducted. The next morning, a special edition of the newsletter appeared in all mailboxes. Pinecrest Estates welcomes Sofia Alvarez as our new Homeowners Association president. Miss Alvarez, a retired schoolteacher and 15-year resident, was elected by unanimous vote. The board also voted to commission an independent review of all HOA bylaws and to freeze all non-essential expenditures pending this review. A town hall meeting will be scheduled in the coming weeks to discuss community priorities. 3 days later, a knock at my door interrupted dinner. Max lifted his head, ears perked, but showed none of the alertness he typically displayed when strangers approached. He must have recognized the scent. Sofia Alvarez stood on my porch, holding a covered dish that filled the air with the sweet smell of cinnamon and baked apples. In her late 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and warm brown eyes behind stylish glasses, she projected the calm authority of someone who had managed classrooms full of teenagers for decades. "Mr. Merritt," she said, extending the dish, "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." "Not at all," I replied, accepting what turned out to be a still-warm apple pie. "Please, call me Jake." "Jake," she nodded. "I'm Sofia. May I come in for a moment?" I invited her inside, where Max greeted her with a gentle nudge against her hand. She scratched behind his ears with the confidence of someone comfortable around dogs. "Beautiful animal," she said. "Golden retrievers are such gentle souls." I offered her coffee, which she declined, preferring to get straight to the point. "The board would like to formally thank you for bringing the financial irregularities to light," she said, settling into a chair at my kitchen table. Many of us had concerns over the years, but Karen had a way of discouraging questions. "I understand," I said, and I did. Bullies maintained power through intimidation, and Karen had mastered the art. "We've frozen the contingency account pending the investigation," Sofia continued. "The good news is that it appears most of the funds are still there. The county prosecutor has assured us they'll try to expedite the case." I nodded, letting her continue. "The board is being restructured. We're creating new positions with actual oversight functions, term limits, and transparent financial reporting." She looked at me directly. "We'd like you to consider taking one of those positions. Your professional expertise would be invaluable." The irony wasn't lost on me. Being invited to join the very organization that had targeted me from day one. "I appreciate the offer," I said, "but I think I'd be more valuable as an ordinary resident. Sometimes you need an outside perspective, someone who isn't caught up in the day-to-day operations." Sofia looked mildly disappointed but nodded in understanding. "The offer remains open if you change your mind. In the meantime, please enjoy the pie. It's my grandmother's recipe." After she left, I cut a slice of the still-warm pie. The flavor was remarkable. Tart apples balanced with the right amount of sweetness and a hint of something unexpected. Nutmeg, perhaps, or cardamom. I saved a tiny, plain apple piece for Max, who accepted it with gentle teeth and appreciative eyes. Over the next week, subtle changes rippled through Pinecrest Estates. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable, like ice thawing after a long winter. Children who had previously been confined to backyards now played catch in front yards and rode bikes on sidewalks. Dogs walked alongside owners who no longer tensed up when passing other houses. Neighbors lingered at mailboxes to chat instead of hurrying back inside. I installed a small wooden bench beside my stubbornly navy blue mailbox, a weekend project that gave Max and me a comfortable spot to observe the neighborhood in the evenings. The first night we sat there, Mrs. Abernathy walked by with her miniature poodle and paused to tell me about her daughter's upcoming visit from Seattle. The second night, Jim from the cul-de-sac stopped to ask about the bench's design, mentioning he might build something similar. By the third night, it had become an unofficial meeting spot. Mr. Chen brought over homemade lemonade. The young couple from across the street introduced their newborn daughter. The retired postal worker from the corner house shared stories about the neighborhood's early days before Karen's tenure. "She wasn't always like that, you know," he told me, leaning against my mailbox. When they first moved in, Thomas was the social one. Karen was quiet, almost shy. Then she got on the board as secretary, and something changed. Each position she moved up, she got a little more controlling. Others shared their stories, too. The family who'd been cited for having basketball hoop visible from the street. The widow, who'd received daily notices when recovering from surgery, left her unable to maintain her yard to Karen's standards. The young man who'd been threatened with legal action over a small pride flag in his window. I kept my responses minimal but friendly, more interested in listening than sharing. Max enjoyed the attention, accepting gentle pats from neighbors who had previously crossed the street to avoid him. One evening, as the summer heat gave way to a comfortable breeze, I sat on my bench as Max dozed at my feet. The wind picked up, setting my wind chimes into a gentle melody that carried across the quiet street. 3 houses down, Sofia Alvarez stepped onto her porch and tilted her head to listen. Our eyes met, and she raised her coffee mug in a silent toast that I returned. Behind me, my non-regulation wind chimes played on, their sound no longer an act of defiance, but simply part of the neighborhood's evening symphony. No one complained about them ever again.